The highway had shrunk to a silver vein under the snow. Jackson drove slow enough that the truck seemed to be thinking things over, the headlights carving a pale path and the heater talking in low, steady breaths. It was Christmas Eve, and the town was as quiet as a held breath. The church at the bend had one string of lights, yellow and stubborn against the white. Jackson had meant to be somewhere else, somewhere that was not here, not alone in a farmhouse thick with Daniel's absence. Instead, he kept coming back to the same roads, to the places where habit had hollowed out grief into something he could manage. Half a mile beyond the bend, a figure rose out of the drift like a question. Jackson saw the shape first as a dark blot, then a shape, then a person who moved like someone who had no business standing in the middle of a county road when the snow was coming down hard. He stopped before the figure reached the shoulder, cut the engine so the world in the cabin could be measured without the truck's complaint. The windows fogged. For a long instant, they only looked at each other. The thin profile of a young man, the way his shoulders pulled up under a coat that had not known warmth in hours, the way his breath came in silvered little puffs. "Hey," Jackson said, and the word was small in the cold. He stepped out on the roadside where the snow had a brittle crust. The wind took at his coat, and the scent of oil and wood smoke rode along the air. He kept his hands where the boy could see them. The young man blinked them like a page being turned. He was younger than Jackson had thought, thin, hair plastered by wet, dark as if someone had tried to take color from him. He had cuts at the knuckles and a bruise purple at the jaw. When he spoke, his voice was paper thin. "Please," he said, "please, can—" Jackson did not ask the questions the sheriff in him wanted to ask. The deputy part moved, patient and professional, but the other part, something older and steadier, cut in. Get him somewhere warm. He took off his gloves and held them out. "Come on," he said, "get in my truck." The boy hesitated, then fell into the seat as if relieved to have a place to be. He smelled faintly of oil paint and something else Jackson couldn't name, raw, like the inside of a closed letter. He tucked his knees up. The blanket Jackson handed over was thin, patched. When the truck heater finally warmed their hands, the boy's fingers unclenched. "You okay?" Jackson asked, watching him in the rear view. The boy's eyes, brown, but rimmed red and rimmed with something else, flicked up. "What's your name?" "Finn," he said. "Finn Holloway." The name landed like ice in Jackson's chest. Holloway. He blinked away the shock. Holloway could be a common name in this county, but it was a name with a rumor track. Holloways who kept to themselves, Holloways who owned a lot of land that had been in one set of hands for decades. He had never wanted to be the kind of man who let names make his hands curl into memory. Yet the old instincts, the ones that had kept him in uniform for a dozen years, asked too many questions to be ignored. "You're not from here," Jackson said, softer. Finn's laugh was a breathy, brittle thing. "I'm from a town 3 hours west," he said. My dad dropped me off, said I was in the way." He looked smaller when he said it, the words like stones. Jackson felt cold in a new way. They drove back slow. The farmhouse rose from the snow, all pale wood and shadow, with a sagging porch light that smelled of salt air and old remembered dinners. Jackson towed Finn into the warm like a shepherd bringing back a lost lamb. He moved through the house on muscle memory, lifelines wired into his bones. Heating cranked, Catalan, the radio a soft murmuring. Then the studio door, where Daniel's easel still stood, swathed in canvas dropcloth and a smell of linseed oil that never left the room even after years. Jackson had not meant to keep the studio a shrine. It had been Daniel's room, his hands and colors lived there, and for months after he died, Jackson had kept it closed, as if opening it would scatter the last evidence of a life into the light. But some things become necessary. The bills, the heat, the fact that having someone in the house who might freeze to death was not a hypothetical. There were small, steadfast pieces of Daniel everywhere. A mug with paint in the bottom ring, a folded scarf that smelled faintly of tobacco and salt, and a gentleness Daniel had carried like a quiet prayer. Over the easel, tacked to the wall with masking tape yellowed at the edges, was a photograph. It was not a flattering picture, but Jackson had always liked the laugh in it, and beside it, odd and incongruous, a clipped headline encased in a plastic sleeve. The Mafia boss begged him to hide. "No one can know you're my boyfriend." Jackson had kept that clipping because Daniel had once kept oddities. Daniel had always loved the messy, the unseemly, giving shelter to the sorts of people the town only read about in whispers. Jackson had put the clipping there half as a joke, half as a reminder. Daniel had sheltered a strange, frightened man once, back when the world was more reckless and their hands were not yet full of the quiet work of later life. The headline had glinted in the studio light like something dangerous and honest at once. Now, seeing it with Finn pressed into the old wing chair, Jackson felt the headline like an omen, like a compass. Finn stood in the doorway, glancing around as if the studio was a body. He touched a jar of brushes with the reverence of a believer tracing a reliquary. He swallowed. Is this, he swallowed. Is this his? Yeah, Jackson said. Daniel's. Finn's mouth made a small sound. I used to do sketches, he said. I drew a lot on trains. He stopped, the words dissolving. I liked to draw people when they didn't notice. Jackson watched him. There was a line of tenderness inside him that had always been toward things that needed tending. Daniel had been the same way. He had been a man who treated wreckage as if it were an instrument. He smoothed edges the way other people smoothed sheets. He had not expected to find himself playing a role Daniel had once inhabited deliberately, but the seat fit. He moved among Daniel's jars and brushes and found himself showing Finn a paler, the way an old soldier might show a younger one how to clean a rifle. They ate stew at the kitchen table while the snow kept falling. Finn spoke in small bursts. He had been sleeping in the truck. He had been dropped off at a turnout because he had refused to deny who he was to his father. He'd said the wrong thing, and the man had driven away. Jackson asked about the parents, about shelter, about whether he had called anyone. Finn's hands tightened around the bowl, the knuckles a little white. I didn't want to go to a shelter, he said. I don't want to be a problem. You're not a problem, Jackson said. He said it because it was true, and because he knew how believable problems could feel when people had no one to announce otherwise. You can stay the night, at least. We'll make a plan in the morning. Finn's laugh was thin again, but there was a spark in it like a match. He looked at Daniel's easel, at the ragged canvas, then down at his hands. I can help, he said. I can clean. I can... Jackson thought of the long months that followed Daniel's death, the small chores that kept the farmhouse breathing. He let his mouth soften. You can help, he said, and you can paint. That night, though, the house refused to be a shelter in any uncomplicated way. Finn's bones had been chilled to an ache, and his nightmares came like shadows that bled into waking. At 3 a.m, Jackson found him on the sofa, coated in a thin sweat, breath racing. He sat beside him without touching, watching the sky go from black to a gray that tasted of ash. You were out on the road, Finn whispered when he could pull his voice together, like he'd found a thread back. I thought he would come back. I kept thinking he'd come back and tell me it was a joke. Jackson's hand rested, finally, on the boy's shoulder. He held on the way you hold a live wire with cloth, careful, present. He didn't come back, he said. He left you. Finn's fingers dug into the throws. Why would he do that? He asked. Why would anyone? His voice shuddered. The question was not aimed at Jackson, but at a world that could make fathers into strangers. Jackson sat with him a long time, letting the house breathe around them. He said small things. about the stew in the morning, about how the heater worked, about where to put wet boots. Because words that named the world often had the power to steady a body. Finn listened like someone learning a new language. In the weak light from the kitchen bulb, Jackson could see the flare of a bruise on Finn's jaw, the way the young man's hands shook when he tried to flatten the waves of hair from his face. By dawn, they had coffee and plans. Jackson drove Finn into town to the sheriff's office. He had been a deputy. He had friends who stayed. Sheriff Miller was as practical as an old boot, with the same dependable sound. Miller had known Jackson for 2 decades. He had seen Jackson's rise and the way grief had carved its own rules. The sheriff listened to Finn's story without rhetoric. He took notes, asked the right questions, and promised he would look into it. "Sounds like reckless abandonment," Miller said, in the clipped way of a man who preferred his law like sensible tools. "If your father's left you on the roadside in a storm, that's endangerment. We'll bring him in for questioning. If he used a vehicle to abandon you, we can charge him." Finn met Miller's eyes with a mixture of shame and relief, the kind of look someone gives when they finally let the harness go and see the ground is there. "I don't want him to," Finn began. "You don't have to decide that today," Jackson said. "You just have to be safe." They filed a report. Miller arranged for a social worker to contact Finn, offered a list of resources for housing and counsel. Jackson felt the professional parts of himself relax, the ones that had lived on procedure and the quiet authority of paper. But under that was a current of anger that never quite made it to the surface. Anger at the idea of a father who would leave his son to a road on Christmas Eve. In the days after, things moved like a slow river finding its course. Sheriff Miller contacted a deputy who had seen a pickup pass with a man in a collar and a boy who looked like he had been carried by wind. The county deputy tracked down a make and model and a license plate that came back to Robert Holloway. When Miller brought Holloway in, Jackson watched from the doorway of the interview room. Holloway was bigger than he had imagined, older, a man whose hands had been used to doing things that did not require tenderness. He had the sort of face that could own a room, the kind that filled chairs with presence. Holloway's eyes, when they landed on Jackson, slid past him like a hand over the back of a chair. "Why did you do it?" Finn said the question, like a challenge and a plea at the same time, when Miller marched him into the room. Holloway's jaw moved. He looked at Finn and then away. "I didn't mean," he said. His voice had the dull ring of a man who had been given reasons before and had found them inadequate. "You were—" "Too much?" Finn interrupted. "Too gay? Too—" Holloway's face folded into fatigue. "People, things, don't always go how you want," he said finally. He looked like a man who had never had to say the truth aloud and found it heavier than expected. Miller's hands were steady on the case file. "Leaving someone in a snowstorm on a county road is an offense," he said. "Abandonment, endangerment. We're charging you." The charge stuck like winter to boot leather. Holloway argued a little. He pleaded for understanding. Finn's voice shook, but it was there, naming the wound. "You left me," he said, "over who I am." Holloway's face went blank, and for a moment the room was a cave where the truth echoed. Then Holloway's shoulders slumped, and the machinery of law began to move. Miller handled the paperwork with a competence that translated grief into forms and signatures. Holloway was taken in, the cell door closing with a sound that felt final and also protective in some odd way. The law doing what the man had refused to do, keeping someone who had done harm from doing more. Jackson stayed through the shuffle because he could. He had spent years in that rhythm and had the patience to be where things landed. Finn sat across from him with his hands in his lap, eyes that had been hollowed and were filling like a river after thaw. There were tears and then a steadier breathing. Miller put a hand on Finn's shoulder, not patronizing, not theatrical, but solid. Afterward, in the truck, Finn leaned his head against the window and watched the world pass sideways in white streaks. He had been offered shelter by a county program, but Jackson had pulled the truck toward the farmhouse as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Finn protested once, then stopped. There was a simplicity to the motion, one person offering a seat at a table and another accepting. It was not heroic, it was domestic, and that made it larger. Over the following weeks, the house took on a new rhythm. Finn slept days when he could, and painted when he could not sleep. He enrolled in an evening art class at the community college, and he took to the brushes with the hunger of someone who had been starving for color. Jackson taught him how to patch a fence and chop kindling, and Finn taught Jackson to look at the world as if there might be angles Jackson had never tried. The chores rounded them into a domesticity that did not yet have names for itself. Therapy was tentative at first. Finn agreed to see a counselor recommended by Sheriff Miller. They talked about abandonment and the scalding shame that made someone believe they were to blame. Finn described the ride down the highway and the small acts of cruelty that had led to that night. He said, once, "I thought if I apologized enough, he'd take me back." "You didn't do anything to deserve that," the therapist told him in the firm, gentle voice of someone who had watched too many people wear blame like a second skin. Finn's mouth made a small sound, something like the beginning of a laugh. "It felt like whatever I wasn't okay," he said. "Like I had to be small," he said. Jackson listened in the kitchen, half hearing the thread of Finn's sessions carried through the thin walls. He had his own kind of therapy in the evenings, painting in Daniel's old studio late into the night until the ache loosened enough to admit new shapes. Sometimes he would stand back from an empty canvas and feel a pressure in his chest like a weight lifted by silence. Finn's presence made the house louder in ways that helped. They started small rituals. Saturday mornings were for coffee and the farmer's market, if the roads were clear. Finn painted while Jackson repaired tools. They had a wordless agreement. Nothing rushed. There were nights when Finn's hands would tremble when he knocked at the bedroom door to ask to borrow a blanket. Jackson would emerge in a flannel shirt and hand it over, and the exchange was intimate in a way neither named. The town watched in its slow, curious way. Neighbors left casseroles and extra blankets at the porch. Someone from the church brought a quilt Daniel had used for winter shows. There was no public spectacle, no banner, no loud declarations, just a gradual folding in, like sewing seams that held. Jackson, who had been used to doing his grief inward, found himself answering small questions about Finn with a voice that had, unexpectedly, warmth. There were cruelties, too. A delivery man who lingered an extra second in the doorway to see the boy with the cheekbone bruise. A local barroom rumor that tried to call the farmhouse an improper project. Jackson learned from millennia of small-town maneuvers which fights were worth having and which he could let pass. He had a sense that confrontation did not always mean spectacle. Sometimes it meant making sure the paperwork for Finn's enrollment in art class was filed properly, or ensuring the deputy's report was clear and official so that Holloway's arrest would stand. One evening, Finn found the clipping in the studio and traced the plastic sleeve with a thumb. "Did he, Daniel, do that?" Finn asked. He had the look of someone trying to assemble a map from scattered stones. Daniel's photograph looked like a man who had been amused by the world. Jackson sat down across from Finn. "Yeah," he said. "Once. He sheltered a kid for a few weeks when a big shot told him to keep quiet about a relationship. Daniel wasn't afraid of messy things." Finn laughed, surprised. "A mafia boss? That's not the kind you see in movies," Jackson said. "Some men have ways of taking what they want in town and calling it protection. Daniel always had a soft spot for people who got shoved to the edges." Finn's fingers lingered on a paint jar. "He kept things for people," he said finally. "Kept them safe." Jackson let the memory rest, like something warm. "He did," he said, "and he made a point of making space." Finn smiled, small and genuine, and then bent back to his work. The studio had always been a place where shelter and creativity braided together. Now Finn's hands moved over a canvas like he was claiming a lineage. Winter thawed toward spring in a slow, harmless way. Finn's painting improved. He began to sell small pieces at the farmer's market, landscapes of the road and portraits of anonymous people who looked like they had just found their way. One customer bought a painting and cried quietly while holding it. Finn's cheeks went pink, and he learned that sale could be both a trade and a conversation. Holloway's court date lingered on calendars with the obstinacy of bureaucracy. He pled not guilty at first, then less angrily when faced with the witness list. There were complications. Holloway had friends, and friends in this corner of the county sometimes meant influence. But Sheriff Miller did the work he promised, and the law, funny and narrow and sometimes blunt, did the thing it could do. It made Holloway answer to what he'd done. The arrest, when it finally came, was not triumphant in the way Finn had perhaps imagined. It was legal and clinical and merciful in a small, blunt way. Holloway was fined and required to attend counseling, and, most important, he was ordered to have no contact with Finn for a set period. Finn's relief was quiet. He did not dance or shout. He sat at the kitchen table and ran a hand over his face. And when Jackson reached for his sleeve, Finn accepted it. The gesture felt like a contract. A person will stay when you ask them to. There were setbacks. Some nights Finn would wake and look for a figure who would not come. Sometimes his fingers would go to his phone, hope blooming and then curdling into disappointment when the call did not come. He had to relearn what safety felt like, to remap trust into something domestic and small. Therapy helped, as did painting, and, crucially, the way other people, Sheriff Miller, neighbors, the counselor, responded with ordinary decency. One afternoon, months after that first rescue, Jackson found Finn in the studio, reverent and furious, working on the portrait that had no model but the house, its angles, and the memory of conversations. Finn painted the porch light and the kettle, Daniel's mug, the sagging step where Jackson had once tripped. It was a portrait of ordinary things made holy by attention. "I want to put a box on the road," Finn said suddenly, not looking up. "A what?" Jackson asked. "A small thing," Finn said, voice quick with an idea. "A roadside box, donations, blankets, socks, a note that says, 'Take what you need, no questions.' Daniel sheltered people. We can give something back for people who are alone on nights like that." Jackson could see it already, a simple wooden box painted blue with a lid sitting on a post at the highway's pullout. He remembered that first night, Finn's thin body like a folded map. He thought of the headline tucked into the studio wall, of Daniel shielding the vulnerable, of the way people who had been kept from belonging could, in time, become keepers of others. "Yeah," he said. "We'll put it up on the edge of town. We'll put a name on it if you want." Finn laughed, a clear, surprised sound. "I'd like that," he said. They built the box in the old barn, hammers and sawdust and half-remembered instructions. It was therapeutic in the way that making something physical often is. The barn smelled of hay and old leather. The light came like a promise through slatted wood. Jackson taught Finn how to plane the edges smooth. Finn painted the box a sky blue that matched the worn sweatshirt he liked. They filled it with things the community donated: mittens, canned soup, a winter blanket someone had sewn with a careful hand. When they set the box by the roadside in the first week of spring, it looked like a tiny beacon. Finn stood back and watched it, like a parent watching a child take a tentative step. He had the cautious, weary hope of someone who had been thrown off course and who now, in small, steady increments, learned to map his own bearings. The town took to the idea. A neighbor left a thermos. A man from the feed store dropped in a tin of soup. Sheriff Miller approved of the plan and volunteered to keep an eye on the box during snowstorms. It was not grand, but it was an answer. It was practical and tactile and human. One evening, as the light slatted across the studio and Finn mixed colors for a new canvas, he looked over at Jackson, who was repairing a door hinge. He thought, not for the first time, about the headline tucked like a ghost in the frame. "Do you ever think about Daniel's choices?" he asked. Jackson paused with the screwdriver. He could feel the weight of his life like a slow, warm stone. "All the time," he said. "He did some things I didn't understand then. He also made space for people like you. He believed that shelter was a kind of justice."
Finn set the brush down. "Do you think—" He let the sentence hang in the kind of silence that expects tenderness. "Do you think I could be more than this? More than a rescue? Will you?" Jackson met his eyes. He had been careful, always careful, about not smoothing grief into substitutes. He had watched Finn's trust form, not a fast bloom, but a slow, deliberate turn. He had kept his hands honest in the small things, fixing, feeding, making fire, and those small things had made him soft in ways he had not let himself be since Daniel died. He walked across the studio and crouched in front of Finn as if to check a canvas. "I don't know what the future will look like in full," he said. "I know I want you here. I know I want to be the kind of man who shows up. If you're asking if I'd be willing to try, to see where this goes, yes." Finn's face unspooled like a sunrise. He laughed, sudden and bright, a sound like paint on canvas. "Don't say yes because it's pity," he said. "I wouldn't know what to do with pity," Jackson said, and there was honesty in that. "I know the difference between saving someone and choosing to stand with them. I'm choosing." The house, as if in celebration, gave a creak, and the kettle sang its small metallic peal.
Outside, the box at the road held a trove of quiet kindness. Inside, two people who had been weathered by different storms found a way to warm each other's edges. There were more decisions to make. Legal matters wound like threads that needed knotting. Finn's application for a scholarship required signatures. Holloway's anger still existed in the world, thin and resentful. But there were also simpler things, the way they learned each other's habits, the way Finn fell asleep easier the night Jackson sang a line from a hymn he and Daniel had used to hum after odd chores, the way Jackson watched Finn's hands when he painted and thought about how hands can tell the truth a person does not. On a quiet night, when the porch light threw a soft oval across the sagging step, Finn brushed his hand along the plastic sleeve of the old headline and smiled in a shy, private way. "Your partner hid people," he said, "and now someone hid me." Jackson's laugh was low. "Daniel had a talent for making room," he said. "He'd be glad you're staying." Finn looked up at him as if suddenly seeing continents. "And you," he said, "are you glad?" Jackson let the weight of his answer gather in his chest. He looked at the man who had once thought himself unmoored and saw a life that had become possible. He reached out and took Finn's hand in the dim porch light. "Yes," he said, "I am." They sat there a while, hands clasped, not making declarations like fireworks, but building something sturdier, a table of plates, a pattern of small kindnesses. The headline on the studio wall, "The Mafia boss begged him to hide, no one can know you're my boyfriend," remained a piece of paper in a room that had become a sanctuary. The words hummed with history and the odd courage of people who had refused to let shame destroy tenderness. The months ahead would have their tests, court hearings, and the slow work of trust. Nights when Finn's phone would remain stubbornly silent and the old pain would flare. Moments when Jackson would find himself looking up at the stars and thinking of Daniel and whether he deserved a new kind of love. But there was, now, a thread of hope. They were making a life that was careful and fierce, a found family stitched from two lonely seams, from the shelter of a studio and a roadside box. On the 1st of April, Finn stood at the county art show with a small portrait tucked under his arm. People praised the piece, the way he'd captured light on a porch and the shape of ordinary hands. Jackson watched from the doorway as Finn accepted a compliment with a blush and a quick, honest thank you. For the first time in a long while, Jackson felt that the future might be more than a folding of old grief. It might be a room large enough to hold both memory and possibility. They had come a long way from the white road that had almost taken him. They were still learning what companionship meant. But every night, the porch light burned, and the little blue box by the highway stood open, a promise. And when Finn painted, the world learned how to look back at itself with kinder eyes. There were more moments to come, hard, tender, necessary. There were people in town who would still whisper, There would be nights when the law and the heart tangled. But for now, the farmhouse stood against the dark, warm as a kept secret spoken aloud. Finn slept in a bed that had once been for other hands, and Jackson kept the kettle warm. The headline on the wall kept its place like a relic, and somewhere between the two of them, a new story was beginning to be told.